good evening, everyone. My name is Connor Moran. I'm the director of the Wisconsin Book Festival. Thank you all so much for joining us to see Carol Anderson for her new book, The Second. We are also joined by John Nichols of The Nation and the Capital Times. Carol, John, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Of course, anytime. You know that, Carol, anytime. I want to take this moment to welcome all of you people watching at home to the Wisconsin Book Festival Fall Celebration. This is our third event over 4 days. We have 4 virtual events tonight, 4 virtual events tomorrow, and then on Saturday, we're doing 1 full day of in-person events at Madison Central Library, 12 authors at Central Library and 3 authors at the Discovery Building on the UW campus. If you are vaccinated and interested, we hope that you will join us for those events. We also have 1 plenary event on Sunday morning virtually with Mary Roach. So many opportunities to get involved in the Wisconsin Book Festival tonight and coming up over the next couple of days. I also want to thank Madison Public Library, the Madison Public Library Foundation, and all of our sponsors. They have been absolutely steadfast in their support of free cultural events throughout the pandemic and really over the last 9 years, but truly over the last 2 years, just deeply, deeply committed. And so I thank them for all of their support and their belief that these are necessary moments for us to gather together and learn. So it is my delight, absolute delight, to welcome Carol Anderson for her book, The Second, about race and guns in America, about the history of the Second Amendment and the application of those laws, that law and those laws that have flowed from it over the course of our 225 years as a nation. I'm going to step away and I'll turn it over to John, who is our moderator tonight. John, thank you so much. And Carol, I will see you both at the end.
Thank you.
Thank you, Connor, so much for your gracious introduction. And Carol, thank you so much for being with us. I want to say a few things up front. Carol Anderson, who is the Charles Howard Candler Professor and Chair of African American Studies at Emory University, writes books about our past that explain our present and anticipate the future. Over the recent decade, she has produced a series of books that are, to my mind, the essential canon of the moment in which we find ourselves. That is why I'm honored to speak with her tonight. What distinguishes Professor Anderson's writing is the skill with which she shines new light on constitutional and historical issues that too many Americans think are settled. She opens up new debates and invites fresh inquiry by focusing on the intersections of race and democracy where, too frequently, this country and its leaders have failed to get things right. Her writing is so vital and so prescient that tonight I will begin by asking several questions regarding a previous book, One Person, No Vote, before quickly moving to a deeper examination of her new book, The Second, Race and Guns in a Fatally Unequal America. One final note, I'm speaking to folks tonight and to Professor Anderson from the Waunakee Public Library in Waunakee, Wisconsin, because of course this is not the Madison Book Festival, it is the Wisconsin Book Festival. And I wanted to highlight the importance of taking these discussions out of our bigger cities and into our small towns and villages. I will note, and I checked just this evening, that Professor Anderson's books are all available at the Waunakee Public Library, although I am told by the head librarian that The Second is checked out, and in fact, there is a waiting list for it. So nice. Professor Anderson, thank you for joining the Wisconsin Book Festival. And I'd like to begin in this moment. The Senate voted yesterday on critical voting rights legislation, and the measure again failed to muster the necessary votes to pass. In your previous book, One Person, No Vote, you focused on how voter suppression is destroying our democracy. Several years on, the issues seem to be all the more pressing. There has clearly been some progress in resisting voter suppression, yet it is also clear that when we talk about an assault on democracy, those who seek to advance that assault have redoubled their efforts. So let us begin with the question, what is your take on where we stand as of October 21st, 2021, in the struggle for voting rights and democracy?
We are in trouble. And that is why we must fight with everything that we have. This democracy is at stake. As we see state after state after state implement one voter suppression law after the next, as we see these gerrymandered districts where politicians can choose their voters instead of their voters being able to choose their representatives, as we see these states lowering the guardrails that helped protect this nation from the assault that Donald Trump's campaign had on trying to overturn a free and fair election, so that they're getting rid of secretaries of state who said no to asking to decertify or to find 11,780 votes, where you're seeing this kind of full-blown assault on democracy, on American citizens. And you have the US Senate sitting there almost like the apocryphal Nero fiddling while Rome is burning. It is just infuriating, where you have people saying our democracy is at stake. These states are doing everything in their power to eviscerate our basic right to vote, from the various laws dealing with IDs, to poll closures, to voter roll purges, to having monitors, which are basically the intimidators at the lines to intimidate voters, all of those things. And to have this Congress, this Senate sit there and act like this isn't happening, and that all you need to do is out-organize.
It is so disappointing.
It is so disappointing. It is so disappointing. And we're not quite sure. I think part of what happened was that we almost dodged a bullet. And because we almost dodged a bullet, we think like there are no more bullets left to aimed at us. But there are. I mean, you see it in the ways the foot dragging and the refusal to be responsive to the subpoenas coming from the January 6th Commission. And that was about overturning an election because they were saying that those folks in Philadelphia, those folks in Detroit, those folks in Milwaukee, those folks in Atlanta, they voted. How dare they vote? How dare they not vote for an avowed white nationalist? And so what that is saying is that if we can have a system where we don't have to count their votes, then we can win. That is not democracy.
And that is, before we go on to talk about the second, that is such a central underpinning of One Person, No Vote. You're a book that for me was both revelatory and also incredibly important for framing out where we're at. Because what you bring out in that book is that so much of this is rooted in racism and anti-Blackness.
Yes, yes. It is the defining of Black people as a corrupting influence on American democracy. So if we can curtail them, if we can remove them, if we can lower their presence in the electorate, we can have a pure democracy. And so you see this in this language of voter fraud, voter fraud, voter fraud. Except when Justin Levitt, who was a California law school professor, where he did a study from 2000 to 2014, he found that out of 1 billion votes cast, I mean, billion votes cast in the United States, there were 31 cases of voter impersonation fraud. So that's like 2 a year out of 1 billion votes. That's the foundation of massive rampant voter fraud, where we get this architecture of suppression being put in place by these state legislatures.
And as you point out in One Person, No Vote, there's deep history on this.
Oh,
This goes back to the beginning of the country.
Yes, there is deep, deep history. That deep history of who is a worthy American, who is who is worthy of voting, who is worthy of participating in this government, of having representation. And so that definition of worthiness is just infused, inflected with race and racism. And so when I get to the Mississippi Plan of 1890, where you have, they're saying, we don't want Black folks to vote. But the 15th Amendment says we can't write a law saying we don't want Black folks to vote. So how are we going to not have Black folks voting? And so what they did was to use the legacies of slavery, poverty, illiteracy, and make those legacies the access to the ballot box. And that is how they were able to circumnavigate around the 15th Amendment, where you had with the poll tax saying, oh, it should be hard to, if you really believed in democracy, you would pay a small fee in order to keep this democracy flowing. So part of what you hear, it's almost like the language that you hear with voter ID. If you really believed in democracy, you would be willing to pay a small fee. If you really believed in democracy and election integrity, you would be willing to get an ID. You would be willing to stand in line. You would be willing to go that extra mile to the polls that we shut down the one that was closest to you. You would be willing to take all of these extra obstacles, hop over every last doggone one of them in order to be able to vote if you really believed in democracy. What the poll tax did, though, was that it amounted to, it seemed nominal on its face, but what it amounted to was 2 to 6% of a Mississippi farm family's annual income. Imagine paying 2 to 6% of your annual income to be able to vote. So while it looked on the surface to be race neutral, which is what the US Supreme Court said in the 1898 Williams decision, oh, there's nothing wrong. The poll tax doesn't violate the 15th Amendment. They said the same thing about the literacy test. It doesn't violate the 15th Amendment. Actually, it did. It really did. And by having that cloak of legitimacy put over an illegitimate law, it did massive damage to American democracy. It is what then led to having just 5%, less than 10% in federal elections in terms of voter turnout. It is what led to the cataclysm on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, where you had people willing to be beaten, being trampled by horses in order to be able to have the right to vote. And
Professor Anderson, I wish I could put you in the president's chair in the Senate and have you speak these words before each vote on these issues. And for our viewers, the folks who are joining us tonight, that's why I wanted to begin on this issue, because Professor Anderson, you saw there what she does. She goes deep into these issues and invites us to look at them with open eyes and with a realistic sense of what's happened. And that's what she does in the book, The Second. It is the book we will discuss tonight at some length. It is an amazing book. I have my copy here. I hope that we can encourage everyone to get their own copy. But if you don't, and you want to wait on the list at the Wanakee Public Library, they are very excited to check it out here as well, and at libraries throughout the region. Let's talk about The Second from the place of your beginning, because it's such an interesting story. You weren't thinking, I'm going to write a book about the Second Amendment. This wasn't, you had other things, other projects going on.
right.
But then something happened in the Twin Cities, outside of Minneapolis. Tell us how you were brought to write this story.
It was the killing of Philando Castile. So who was the Black man who was in his car in Minnesota, and he was pulled over by the police. And the police officer asked to see Philando Castile's ID. And so Philando Castile, following NRA guidelines, alerts the officer that he has a licensed, legally licensed weapon that he is carrying in the car. He says, but officer, I'm reaching for my ID as you have asked. And the police officer shoots him dead. And so Philando Castile, let's be clear, wasn't brandishing the weapon. He wasn't threatening the officer. He was following NRA guidelines. He was killed simply because he had a gun. And the NRA, the chief defender of the Second Amendment, goes virtually silent. And is pushed by its Black members to say something. And so what the NRA says was, we believe that everyone, regardless of race, sexual orientation, has the right to bear arms. Now, this is the same NRA that went after, with Ruby Ridge and with Waco, went after federal officers who were shot and killed, calling them jackbooted government thugs. And that same NRA is like, when a Black man is killed for merely having a weapon. And so journalists and pundits were asking, they said, don't Black people have Second Amendment rights? And I went, ooh, that is a great question. That is a great question. And that's what started me on this hunt. Do Black people have Second Amendment rights?
And a great scholar begins with a great question. And we'll look where it took you in a moment, but one last thing on this, on the Philando Castile case. As you've noted in conversations about this, he was aware, and in the book, he was aware of the danger he was in. Even though he was following the NRA protocols and doing everything proper. In fact, perhaps it's important to point out, he was following them because he was so aware of the danger. He had spoken to his mother about wondering whether he should exercise his right to carry a gun because he knew of other Black men in similar situations who had been killed.
I mean, it's just, and that gets at the core of this book. It is just so jarring. I mean, this is what struck me about Philando Castile. He was doing everything he was supposed to do. And doing everything that you're supposed to do was absolutely no protection against the anti-Blackness that resonates fear, danger, 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 threat. And that fear, danger, danger, threat, when it is linked with gun ownership, creates an exponential fear that basically puts the crosshairs on Black people.
And I don't think that even now, if people don't read your book, that our media has even begun to clarify that reality.
No, they really haven't. They really haven't. They are still really stuck on the kind of framing of the Second Amendment as, is this about a well-regulated militia or is this about an individual right to bear arms? That is not the question. The question really deals with African Americans and their rights and the role of the Second Amendment in undercutting those rights.
Let's go back and take a look at where things went awry. And I often, when I'm talking about the founding of this American experiment, we refer to the original sin, which of course was enslavement, and the policies that extended from it. And there are plenty of original sins, but this is one that seemed to so influence the founding of the Republic. And so tell us about where your exploration, your searching for an answer to this question coming out of Minnesota, took you to Philadelphia and then Virginia in the 1780s and 1790s.
Right. Actually, it took me all the way into the 1600s to Virginia, where I'm looking at the development of these slave codes that are about making sure that the enslaved did not have guns. And so every time there was a rumor of an uprising, you just heard the fear coursing through the white community there that they're going to kill us. They're going to kill us. How do we stop this? And so the slave codes just kept coming until we got to the Stono Rebellion in 1739 in South Carolina, where enslaved men rose up and were fighting for their way to freedom to Spanish Florida, and the militia came after them. And from that 1739 uprising, where over 60 people were killed, you had laws coming in from South Carolina that said, one, if you catch an enslaved person trying to get to Florida, kill them and you can scalp them. And the next law was the Negro Act of 1740. That became the kind of blueprint for slave codes in the United States. And that blueprint had in there to deny literacy, but also to deny access to guns, and to help create further, to embed the architecture. The part of what's happening in South Carolina's law is the architecture of control of Black people. So the slave patrols and the militia, as well as this disarmament, this ban on Black people having guns. And so when we then get to the Constitution, because
if I can interrupt you just for 1 second, there was the intervening American Revolution.
Yes.
In which it's an important point in your book.
Yes, and so in this moment in the American Revolution, what you have is that you're not getting enough white men who are joining the Continental Army. And so they had initially had a ban on Blacks joining the army. But when you're not getting enough white men to join, and you've got the British are coming, the British are here, Lord have mercy, the British are here, then you get these states in the North who are providing for, if Black enslaved men will fight, they will get their freedom. And so you get this slew of Black men joining the Continental Army. It is an integrated army. But what happens was, so the British, and so it stiffens up north. So the British are like, we're going to hit the soft underbelly. We're going south. And so they hit Georgia and they take Savannah like that. Then they're looking at Charleston. George Washington sends his emissary down there, John Lawrence, son of South Carolina, to say, look, you only have 750 white men available to take on 8,000 British troops. We've run the numbers. That won't work. You're going to have to arm the enslaved, because South Carolina had deployed the bulk of its white men as the militia to control that enslaved population, to keep them from uprising and to keep them from running to the British, which was happening in droves. And so South Carolina's like, oh, we're not doing that. We can't believe you have the audacity to ask us to put weapons in the hands of those whom we have enslaved. We would rather take our chances with the British. So you begin to think about this. So this kind of hardball, this playing chicken with the viability of the United States of America, if the control of Black people is not honored. This starts early. And so, right, so you got South Carolina going, no, we're not doing that. But, you know, we can't believe that you won't come down here and fight for us. And they're like, fight for yourselves. And they're like, right? And they're like, we can't believe you have the audacity to tell us to do this. And so that sense of victimhood is also running through this. We get, yeah.
I was going to say then, so as you establish in your book, Black men, Black people played a critical role in establishing the United States as soldiers, as people who fought in this revolution, something that again is often lost in the history. And then we turn around, we get to the point of, okay, establishing the structures of the country. And suddenly, while South Carolina may seem like something of an outlier in your story, South Carolina becomes, and Southern states become the dominant players.
Absolutely. Because the creation of the United States of America was so important to so many of the delegates that it allowed the Southern delegates to basically hold the US hostage, to say, if we don't get protection of slavery and protection of slaveholders in this document, we walk, we're done. And that led to the 3/5 clause, which provides additional representation for the South, because now you're counting enslaved people as people, as 3/5 of those in that state. Now they can't vote. They have the South has considered them as property for everything else, but now they're human beings who get to be counted for representation. It also leads to a 20-year extension of the Atlantic slave trade. And it leads to the fugitive slave clause in the Constitution. And all of these things are in there because the South was playing hardball. If we don't get what we want, we walk.
And yet the South was not satisfied.
Oh,
because we got the Constitution,
right?
And then they said, well, hold it. It's a little bit like what we're seeing in Washington now with the negotiations over the reconciliation bill. Suddenly you've got senators saying, oh, now I want to negotiate some more. The South comes in and says, well, we're not going to approve this Constitution.
Right.
Unless.
Right. And so in Virginia has gone, we're not doing this. And so Washington sends James Madison down to Virginia to take on the Patrick Henry, George Mason, and the Anti-Federalists there. And what they want is because Madison has put control of the militia in the Constitution under federal control. And that's because despite the narrative that we have about this noble militia, when it came to fighting the British, sometimes they show up, sometimes they wouldn't. Sometimes they would start and then they take off running. I mean, you could not trust the militia. And then you also had Shays' Rebellion, which happened in Massachusetts, where you had these white men who were angry about taxation policy, so they attacked the government. And so the Massachusetts government calls out the militia to take on Shays' Rebellion, and the militia's like, no, we're not doing that. And you actually had some members of the militia join Shays' Rebellion. So it took Boston merchants basically hiring a mercenary army to take on Shays' Rebellion and put the uprising down. So when it came to the militia, there wasn't a lot of trust there for domestic tyranny or taking on a foreign invasion. So when he put it in the federal, in the Constitution under federal control, basically to get it organized, to get it systematized, Patrick Henry and George Mason were like, no. We cannot trust that Congress that has folks from Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, all of those people who have gotten to the point where they're getting rid of slavery in their own lands. We can't trust them to send the militia down when our enslaved folks revolt. We will be left defenseless. And Madison's like, look, you got the 3/5 clause. Look, you got the Atlantic slave trade. Look, you got the fugitive slave clause. And they said, it's not enough. We won't ratify until we get a Bill of Rights that controls the federal government and that makes sure that we've got the militia. And if we don't get what we want, we will hold another constitutional convention. And all Madison saw was Pandora's box of going back to the old Articles of Confederation that didn't work. And so in that first Congress, he's in there, you know, one of the congressmen said he was like a man obsessed. He was like a man haunted by Patrick Henry, drafting these bills of rights. And what he came up with, when you think about it, freedom of the press, free speech, freedom of religion, right? Not the right not to be legally searched and seized, the right to a speedy and fair trial, the right not to have cruel and unusual punishment, the right to a well-regulated militia for the security of a free state. What? That is the bribe to the South that says you control the militia, and the militia, we understand, is necessary for the control of Black people.
And that brings us this. Now we have come to the Second Amendment.
Yes.
And the second is part of that Bill of Rights. And I think, again, we don't have enough time to go into how badly constitutional history is taught quite frequently, and what a struggle it is to get it taught right. But it wasn't just the Second Amendment. As you detail in your book, immediately there started coming additional laws, the Uniform Militia Act and things of that nature. So this wasn't just one amendment.
No, no. So you have the Naturalization Act of 1790 that defines who can be an American, what immigrant can be an American. And what they come up with is basically, if you're white, that's who can be an American. So you're getting citizenship defined as white. And then you have the 1792 Uniform Militia Act that says that all white men between the ages of 18 and 45 must join the militia and must have a gun. So you get citizenship. Who are citizens? White men or white people. Then who can be in the militia? White men, 18 to 45, because for the defense of America, these are the citizens and they must have a gun. I mean, this is really laying the foundation, defining worthiness, defining who are you protecting this nation from? Who's the threat? Yeah.
Anti-Blackness is so writ large across that, because it's the white man, and the white man's got to have a gun.
He's got to have a gun. He's got to have a gun.
And now there's one other thing that's playing out in this time that you talk about in your book as well. There's Benjamin Franklin and some folks saying, well, hold it, maybe this system isn't that great a system anyway.
Right. And so you have Benjamin Franklin in that first Congress coming to Congress with a petition from the Quakers saying that Congress has the power to end slavery and it must do so. And James Madison looks at this because the Southern delegation, the Southerners, have just lost their minds, and they filibustered even before we had the word filibuster. They harangued, they berated, they bullied for hours upon hours. They threatened, whoever tries to take my slaves away from me, they're in danger, mortal danger. And so James Madison, seeing this, and he's afraid that this nation that he has worked so hard to stitch together is going to fall apart, erupt on the shoals of slavery again. And so he sees the report coming out of the Congressional Committee that says, okay, what we can do is we can tax the enslaved, we can tax slavery to the point where it's not profitable. And he sees that and he went, no, this is exactly what Patrick Henry, during the Constitutional Ratification Convention, he talked about, they're going to come after us either with the militia, or they're going to come after us with taxation. And so he's like, I've got to stop this thing now. And so he crafts this language that is, Congress does not have the power nor the authority to dismantle slavery, nor to care about the conditions, intervene in the conditions in the states where slavery exists.
And they even barred debate about slavery. So for the better part of 60 years or decades, the Congress wasn't even supposed to debate it. John Quincy Adams would occasionally show up and, raise the word. But enslavement was
verboten.
It was not allowed to be spoken of. And so decades pass, more laws, and you detail it so well in your book. In the aftermath of the Civil War, we're passing 3 new amendments. We're clarifying rights for Black men at this point. There's a sense at that point that somehow we must be pivoting. But in fact, we weren't.
We weren't. You had massive violence raining down on the Black community. And you had President Andrew Johnson who had pardoned the lion's share of those in the Confederacy leadership. And so they were reassuming their positions in these state governments and passing these laws known as the Black Codes. And the Black Codes were about reinstalling slavery by another name. And so it was about that the freed people would have to sign annual labor contracts, and they couldn't leave their employer. And that if they didn't sign the labor contract, they could be arrested and basically auctioned off. But it also had, yes, but it also had that they had to be disarmed. Because when you are trying to take folks' freedom away from them after they have just tasted it, they knew that if they had the weapons, then these were the weapons that they had gained from the Civil War, that it was going to be on. So if you have the law saying they cannot have weapons, that then gives that new architecture of the criminal justice system the ability to go in there and seize those guns. And you had Black folks trying to fight back. And you had the Black troops who were stationed in the South and in the midst of this violence, trying to get in between angry white Southerners and the freed people, trying to protect the freed people. White Southerners then hollered up to Andrew Johnson, you know, this violence would stop if we didn't have all of these colored soldiers here. And they enrage us. They have the audacity to march with their weapons. And you know, they're just trying to kill every white person here in the South. That's why they're here. If you get rid of them, we will have peace. And Johnson removes the Black troops from the South. The violence doesn't stop, it basically intensifies. It is to the point where Annette Gordon-Reed calls it a slow motion genocide. The violence is so intense. And it is so intense that after the Colfax massacre and the Hamburg massacre, Colfax, Louisiana, Hamburg, South Carolina, that President Ulysses S. Grant, so we're towards the tail end of Reconstruction, says, you know what all of these states have in common? It's not Christianity. It's not civilization. It is the right to kill Negroes. Now think about the President of the United States looking at that butchery and seeing that the Supreme Court has said there is no accountability for that mass murder, those mass murders. And that, so what we have is a society where you have the right to kill Negroes.
And so,
yeah,
Reconstruction ends.
Yes.
In the worst, and we could take another hour on that. But let's go forward 100 years. Let's go forward 100 years through A. Philip Randolph and forcing the integration of the defense industries, forcing the integration of the Army finally, the first Civil Rights Act of 1957, Dr. King and again, Randolph in Washington, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, this whole history and all of this progress, Lyndon Johnson signing voting rights and civil rights.
Yeah.
Surely that's the pivot point then, right? I mean, because finally we've put this history behind us but no.
And so I picked that story up in 1967. Where you have the founding of the Black Panther Party for self-defense. And the genesis for the Black Panther Party for self-defense is the massive police brutality that is raining down on the Black community. And there is no accountability in the system. They have tried to hold legislative hearings. They have tried to get legislation passed, something to stop the police from killing Black folks, from beating up on Black folks, for falsely arresting Black people. Nothing. And so the Panthers, led by Huey P. Newton, who was a law school student, and Bobby Seale, they decide what they are going to do to protect that community is to police the police. Bobby and Huey knew the law. California was an open carry state. They knew what kinds of guns they could carry. They knew how they had to carry them, and they knew how far away from the police they had to stand while the police were making an arrest. And so there they were, carrying their guns openly. And the police did not like it, did not like it at all. And so they ran up to Don Mulford, who was a conservative in the California Assembly, and said, we need your help. We need you to make what the Panthers are doing illegal, because every time we pull them over to try to arrest them, we can't get them on anything. They're carrying the kinds of guns that are legal, that you're able to carry. They're carrying them the way that you're supposed to be carrying them. They're doing everything legally. We need to make them illegal. And Mulford, with the help of a representative from the NRA, begins crafting this gun control legislation. And you have Ronald Reagan saying, I'm eagerly awaiting this bill to hit my desk and I will sign it immediately. This was about how do we take what the Panthers are doing to protect the Black community and make that illegal. So you see in this legislation isn't about how do we stop the police from killing Black people? How do we stop them from the terror raining down? How do we put accountability into the system? Instead, it is how do we weaken the defense mechanisms in the Black community?
Yeah. And the Panthers themselves became targets of police violence.
Absolutely.
Fred Hampton and across the country.
Oh, yes. Yes. With Fred Hampton, you had where an informant draws a map, a layout of his apartment, and you get this raid, this early morning raid into that apartment where just over 100 bullets are fired into this apartment. Fred Hampton is killed. Mark Clark is killed. And you have the police saying, we were defending ourselves. They shot back at us. They shot at us. This was just in self-defense. Except a forensic expert went in there and found that more bullets were going in than out. And the 2 bullets that were going out actually came after the barrage of bullets coming in. Yeah.
And so we have these incidents, we have this reality, and you have this complex new kind of iteration of the NRA, where it's actually participating in, as you point out, gun control.
Right.
But not gun control for everyone.
No.
Right? It's a very narrowly defined gun control.
Yes.
And that's an important thing to understand out of this period, because, and I think that's one of the things that's so powerful in your book, it is a reminder that that many of our debates that we have today about gun control are ill-defined. We don't really understand the full perspective, the full sense of what's going on.
Absolutely. As I said earlier, we're so enmeshed in talking about, is this the right to a well-regulated militia, or is this an individual right to bear arms, that what we're not really grappling with is the anti-Blackness that is infused in the Second Amendment, that is about the evisceration of Black people's rights, that is about how do we contain and curtail what we see as a threat to American democracy, as a threat to American society. How do we do that? And so I look at, as you know, I then began to look at several of the laws that the NRA has really championed that are about this defense of the right to bear arms, such as Stand Your Ground, which is that defense law, right? That says you have the right to self-defense. And it expands on the Castle Doctrine. The Castle Doctrine says if somebody comes into your home, you have the right, who's not supposed to be there, you have the right to defend yourself, to ward off that intruder. What Stand Your Ground does is it expands that. So it says, wherever you have the right to be, and you perceive a threat, you have the right to defend yourself.
Well, takes you out of the house, onto the street.
Onto the street, anywhere you have a right to be, right? So in the parking lot, in the grocery store, anywhere you have a right to be, and you perceive a threat, you have the right to use lethal force. There's so many problems with that. One of the key ones is the perception of threat. scientists, psychologists have looked at this and have found that Black people are the default threat in American society. You see Black people and it's like danger, Will Robinson, danger. It is. And so this is why when you look at the way that Stand Your Ground has been operationalized, whites who kill Black people under Stand Your Ground are 10 times more likely to walk under justifiable homicide than Blacks who kill whites under Stand Your Ground. 10 times more likely. That's how this is operationalized. Yes.
And you detail this in your book and go through many of the cases that we have thankfully, as painful as they are, begun to see in our news. And you tell these stories. I want to bring in a couple questions from folks as our clock ticks so fast, it's painful. But it relates to this, I think, pretty well. And that's how brilliant our folks in the audience are. When you talk about this default position, someone asks, have you learned anything in your research about why white shooters are routinely apprehended while Black people with or without guns are so often shot and killed?
It is, I mean, I look at it, it's like why Dylan Roof was apprehended. Right? Yeah. Why the mass shooter in Aurora, Colorado, in the movie theater was apprehended. But why Tamir Rice, who is the 12-year-old boy playing in the park in Cleveland with a toy gun, is shot within 2 seconds of the police rolling up on him. It is, you hear it in terms of the sense of the humanity of white people, that officers see the humanity of white people, that officers recognize that they don't think of whiteness as a threat, where Blackness is the threat. And so it is in that disparity that you see this really disparate response to the violence that rains down on Black folks. It is what made Jonathan Farrell in North Carolina, who was the young man who was in a car accident, and he knocked on a woman's door for help, and she called the police afraid, and the police pull up, and he's like, oh great, I've got some help here now. And he walks toward them and they shoot him dead, saying they were afraid. He was unarmed, but he was Black. And so he was armed as a threat.
I think your section, by the way, on Tamir Rice and the comparisons you make is, to my mind, if I were to pull out one section of the book that drives these points home so powerfully, it is a brilliant juxtaposition and an agonizing one.
Oh my, yeah, because I'm looking at Tamir Rice and Kyle Rittenhouse. Kyle Rittenhouse.
We're going to get to him in a second. Yeah.
Yes, right? You know, as you know, he's the 17-year-old who crossed state lines to go to a protest in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where Jacob Blake had been shot in the back 7 times by a police officer. And Kyle Rittenhouse has an illegally obtained AR-15. As he walks by the police officers, the police are like, oh, we're so glad you guys are here.
They gave him water, right?
Right. It's hot out here. You want some water? And then he goes and there's an altercation and he ends up shooting 3 men, killing 2 of them and seriously wounding a 3rd. He walks back towards the police with his hands up as if to surrender, and they go right by him. It doesn't even register that he is someone who has killed somebody. He doesn't register as a threat. And yet you look, because they're like, he's got his Second Amendment rights. You see how the right wing just really swirled around Kyle Rittenhouse, saying, you know, he was part of a well-regulated militia just doing his Second Amendment rights. He has his Second Amendment rights. But you did not hear that with Tamir Rice, who was a 12-year-old boy playing in the park with a toy gun. And granted, it didn't have the orange tip on it, but Ohio is an open carry state. And so he's in an open carry state with what looks like a gun in a park by himself, not threatening anyone. And he was shot within 2 seconds.
We have a couple of questions about open carry and concealed carry. And it's interesting that Wisconsin, where we're book festivaling today, is a state that did not have open carry until very, very recently. And then, of course, under Scott Walker, getting rid of labor unions, doing all sorts of other things, these things get altered. And someone asks, why suddenly the big push for open carry in a handful of states that don't have it now?
And I think part of what you're seeing is the kind of mantra that we are under siege. This white community, we're being demographically overtaken. We have to protect ourselves. You see it and you hear it. I look at Jonathan Metzl, who wrote a book called Dying of Whiteness. And one of the things that he does is he goes to Missouri and he meets with families who have had a family member who has died of gun violence. And in those meetings, they broach the issue of gun safety laws. And they are absolutely opposed to them. They're like, are you kidding? If I don't have my gun, those people from St. Louis will come down here and take everything that we have. It is like listening to George Mason in 1788 talking about we will be left defenseless. It is also the language that I heard Lauren Boebert say. We will be left defenseless. We'll be left defenseless against those gangbangers, those thugs, and those drug dealers. Which
a member of Congress saying this, yes, not in ancient history, but now.
But now, and I mean, and what we know is that in America, those are dog whistle. That's dog whistle language for Black people. We will be left defenseless. And so I think that that sense of fear of Black people being left defenseless, and you don't know that the police will be there to protect you in time. So we have to be armed. And I've got to say as well, what this does, this anti-Blackness, is that this pandemic of anti-Blackness means that we're not able to address the pandemic of mass shootings. So every time we talk about it, we will be left defenseless. And so we're making this trade-off as a society that we're willing to be vulnerable in the grocery store. We're willing to be vulnerable in our schools. We're willing to be vulnerable in our where we work. We're willing to be vulnerable in our churches. We're willing to be vulnerable where we dance. We're willing to be vulnerable in our movie theaters. Just as long as we don't have to give up our guns and be left defenseless against the Black horde that's coming.
You are so powerful when you speak of these things. And I want people who haven't read your book yet to know that your writing is even more powerful. And we're down to the last moments, and I hate to tell you. And we have one literary question before I go into one thing. I want closing off thought here, and that is, I've never had this complaint in a book session like this. Someone says your books are so well researched and they're not long enough. And I do notice this. Your books are, in the scheme of things, quite short. In fact, in this book, I'll show people physically that this part is the book and this is the notes. This is the professor's notes here in the back. So this is a relatively slim volume. Am I right that you write a slim volume because you want a lot of people to read it and to get, not to be overwhelmed, but to take this core point?
Exactly. That's exactly why I do this, because I want this book to have widespread readership. And I know that if I'm writing a 500-page, 600-page tome, that's not going to happen because folks are so busy. They're looking at a 500-600-page book and going, I had time to get into that. But I know that if they look at a book that's like 200 some pages, they're like, oh yeah, I can knock that out in a weekend. Yeah, I could do that. And then walk, and I do so heavy on the footnotes because it's so important that it's really clear this isn't some musing. This is based on evidence. This is based on what folks are saying, what scholars are writing from the letters of the founding fathers. That's where this work is coming from. And so, yes, it's about access.
This is also the answer, I think, the answer to one of the other questions we have, which is, of course, people always say, well, what should we do going forward? And I won't try to put words in your mouth. I will say that for me, reading this book gave me a much greater perspective on how to enter into debates about gun violence. And perhaps that's the answer, right? Is that I will do the promotion for you and say, read the book. And in many ways, that gives you a sense of a new way to approach the debate on guns. Is that a fair?
That is absolutely fair. That I really believe that we are having the wrong conversation in this nation. And we can have a much better, richer, more evidence-based conversation about what true safety and security looks like.
I get to read you close your book in Kenosha, Wisconsin, the last section. And that is tragically where so many of the things come together. And for our state, still wrestling with these issues as trials and legal struggles go on. But I do think your book closes with the best paragraph, one of the best paragraphs I've ever read in any book. And it is, that is why the current day veneration of the Second Amendment, driven by the lobbying and publicity campaign of the NRA, is frankly akin to holding the 3/5 clause sacrosanct. They both were designed to deny African Americans humanity and rights while carrying the aura of constitutional legitimacy. They both damaged American democracy and called into question the basic founding principles of equality. The second is lethal, steeped in anti-Blackness. It is the loaded weapon laying around, just waiting for the hand of some authority to put it to use. What powerful words.
Thank you. Meant every one of them. Thank you.
Carol Anderson, thank you so much for joining us tonight for a vital conversation for the Wisconsin Book Festival. I will recommend get this book, get it at the Wanakee Public Library if you can. Get it in a bookstore also, buy a lot of copies. And let me please thank you one more time for joining us. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you.
It's been wonderful talking with you, and thank you so much for doing this, John, and thank you so much, Connor, and the Wisconsin Book Festival for having me.
Carol, like I said, anytime. Thank you so much for making time to talk to all of us. John, thank you for your wonderful questions and for walking us through. And while I do love the Wanakee Public Library, I would be remiss to my boss if I didn't say also get one from the Madison Public Library.
Absolutely.
There's one on the display at Central Library right now. I saw it when I left today. I checked it while we were on. You can go in the morning and get your copy of the second. Or please visit our bookselling partners at A Room One's Own. Buy a copy for yourself. Buy a copy for someone else. We are only here because Carol does great work, and then we buy that book, and then Carol gets to do more great work. So please, if you have the means, buy a copy of the second. Also, if you have the means, please stick around for our conversation with Miriam Taves at 8:30, or join us tomorrow for 4 wonderful book festival events, including Celeste Headley for her book, Speaking of Race. Celeste is also one of the most wonderful people to hear from in American culture, along with Carol, who I call a national treasure all the time. And we hope to see some of you on Saturday at Madison Central Library. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you, John. Thank you, Carol. Until next time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.